English or Spanish? Why not both? Let's skip the intro. You know what Proto-Indo-European is, but how did it turn into English? Well, a few rules and a lot of irregular changes that aren't really rules. I've tried to make this video before and it's always way too long, so I'm just going to jump straight into it. Well, I kind of always do that, just because recently my videos have relatively simple premises. The first steps are the common ones that happened in a lot of Proto-Indo-European languages: coloring of laryngeals. Of the three vowel qualities, E grade is the most common and sort of the default, and it changes into ah when next to a h and o when next to a h. H1 is oftentimes referred to as the E coloring laryngeal, but it doesn't have any effects on other vowels, so it's really just the nothing laryngeal. Kentamization is pretty simple too. You just replace the palatovelars with regular velars. Syllabic unpacking is also common to all languages. A syllabic consonant gets an inserted oo to make it normal in Germanic. I should probably include an example word. I can keep the nature of the changes over to the side. That's probably a bad example, whatever. Some roots end in a dental. Some suffixes start with a dental. If you do both of these at once, an S is inserted to keep them from fighting. Then that S eats both of them and geminates. If it's after a long vowel or a consonant, it then shortens. The same is true for all geminates, but all the others are pretty rare. Next up, the word final long vowel of an AN stem lengthens further. Technically, we don't necessarily know it's overlong. It could be a pitch accent thing, but the point is, it's separate from the word final long vowel of an A stem. Speaking of which, now all laryngeals disappear, except for the ones between two consonants, and they force the previous vowel to lengthen, including H1, so I guess it's not the nothing laryngeal. Now, this puts a lot of vowels in hiatus, or next to each other, and there are also vowels that are normally in hiatus, so they all merge into a long or overlong vowel. So, I guess that's evidence that it is a length thing. Next up is Cowgill's Law, which may or may not exist. H3 might turn into G if it's in front of a W, and maybe H2 does also. There are only 3 examples of this, and only one of them is a good example, but it's so specific it'll probably never come up. The remaining laryngeals turn into schwa. Next up, qua becomes qua. I'm surprised it took us this long to get here, but there you go. Next up, ku becomes ku. I doubt this can affect the same consonant twice, so nobody has to go through that emotional whiplash. Word final non-high short vowels disappear. To be honest, you don't have to worry too much about changes to unstressed vowels and final consonants, because most of Proto-Germanic is already solved with specific reflexes of each endings, the vocative being nothing, for example. Grimm's Law is the granddaddy of Germanic sound changes. All the stupid aspirated voiced plosives become regular voiced, the voiced consonants become voiceless, and the voiceless become fricatives unless they're part of a consonant cluster, in which case it only affects the first consonant. A note about the newly formed voiced plosives: in the middle of a word they turn into voiced fricatives. This isn't written because you can tell which one it is from where in a word it is, but pay attention to it, partially because it will be important later, but also it will be immediately important for Werner's Law, the grandmommy of Germanic sound changes. All these newly formed fricatives bounce back over into the voiced fricatives if they have a short unstressed vowel in front of them. Now, because stress varies a lot in Proto-Indo-European, that means different forms of a word can be affected differently by Werner's Law. That generally means they just decided to stick with one, though they usually didn't make the decision until Old English. Some forms, like was, were, even stayed irregular until Modern English. Also, as you can tell by that example, sa also voices to za. This happens universally at the end of a nominative, by analogy to all the other words. Words like kalar from Goltoft had both syllables affected by Werner's Law, thus appearing to have no stressed syllables. Anyway, unlike Proto-Indo-European, stress doesn't vary a lot in Proto-Germanic because it always falls on the first syllable, so we can stop writing it. Now, word initial g becomes b. This is pretty much only observed in the word bid, so take it with a grain of salt. Oo becomes o. Eu becomes o in unstressed syllables before a consonant. E becomes e in unstressed syllables unless it's before This one in particular will be important for later. Yi becomes e. You might want to think about writing the y with a j now. A and o become the same vowel, all lengths. Don't get too comfortable though, they'll split up soon enough. Turns into at the end of a word and then disappears and nasalizes the vowel before it if there is one. Also turns into before a dental consonant. Becomes This only affects the first person singular past ending for weak verbs and is otherwise useless for English. All the remaining traces of laryngeals disappear. Unless necessary for phonotactics, then they become becomes nwa becomes n, and zum becomes m. This may affect other combinations of voiced consonants. Word final t disappears after an unstressed syllable. This pretty much only affects the ablative ending, which doesn't even exist in Germanic. Wa becomes wa. I guess that explains why there aren't any gwa words in English. Native words. Now, like I said, if an a is any kind of long, it becomes o. So now we have the distinction between feminine and neuter o endings. Length matters, folks. Anyway, if you'll recall, all unstressed a's, except for became e. Now, stressed a's have the opportunity to become an e if an e or a y is in the next consonant. It's the earliest form of umlaut, officially called I mutation. Anyway, you know how the e becomes an e? I don't think we've done that yet. So let's say e becomes e whenever it occurs before a nasal. And then nasals disappear before ch, which isn't written because it's a uniform thing. And speaking of which, this is Proto-Germanic. The Proto-Indo-European to Proto-Germanic step is probably the hardest, considering all the weirdness that goes on with influence from the other Indo-European languages and confusion surrounding the initial form, and it's not attested in writing. The journey to Old English will be quicker, probably. Next, the third syllable drops off. Now, most words are 2 syllables, so this doesn't affect them. Even the longer ones want to stay in analogy with other nominative forms, so they don't change. It does affect oblique forms, but again, only regularly, so knowing this rule is really only important for a 3-syllable irregular word, which is such a restrictive form that it really never happens. Now we have umlaut, which only affects short vowels and is allophonic, so it's not written. It turns back vowels into front vowels. If you'll recall, short o can't exist, so it's not really part of this, but now it does exist because u can shrink down into o if there's an a in front of it, although that doesn't really conflate because both rules require different vowels. Technically, ya would satisfy this, but ya prevents a mutation from working, hence gold guild, and sometimes it just decides not to work anyways, as we see in wolf. Some more ending changes occur, shortening long vowels, then overlong vowels. The long o shortens into an u, which ultimately drops off, but it's important to keep track of when it drops off for reasons we'll get to. Unstressed ao becomes o, and unstressed I becomes e. Eventually, the stressed vowels will do something similar, and by something similar, I mean the complete opposite. Long e becomes long a, word final ja disappears, non-word final ja becomes ra. Remember all the way back in Werner's Law where these consonants are actually other consonants? Well, not anymore. Actually, the still is, and it will stay that way for some time, and the changes back into duh, so we don't need to change the notation. However, the in the middle of a word becomes fa, which is usually the at that point. We've talked at length about vowels before ya, but what about consonants? They get longer. This is called a geminate, and it's more stable, but pretty much pronounced the same in English. Eventually, the ya will drop off too, but not yet. You know what I hate about the word ancient? It's pronounced with a t sound. Tell me you can't hear that. Face it, nsh is a terrible consonant cluster. The West Germanics agreed, as well as and nts. The nasal is ripped away and the vowel before it becomes long and nasal, but that only affects because all the other nasal vowels become normal. Becomes if there's no nasal preventing it. Becomes if there's no back vowel or nasal preventing it. Does not become It just doesn't. Since is itself a back vowel, it prevents short from fronting. That's the very earliest of Old English, and it's also where I'm going to put this video on pause. Stay tuned for next week as we make it to Middle English and then make an uncalculated and precarious jump straight to Modern English.